Uh, I wanted to talk a little bit about how, I think some people wonder why this sort of topic takes up an entire chapter in an American History Survey book. Because it seems as if it's all about stuff that, or mostly about stuff that doesn't exist anymore. But in reality, it really does exist, because after all, the Second Great Awakening is the Second Great Awakening after the first one. There's even a Third Great Awakening in the late 19th century, early 20th century. That's very, very important. And then there's um, a period in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the rise of of evangelical religion, having very strong political implications, and these religions and preachers and that sort of stuff being involved in politics and in social reform and all that kind of thing. So it is extremely relevant to all these major periods in American history, and I can't stress enough the fervor with which these people believed in what they're doing. As we'll see in a minute, especially when we talk about anti-slavery and women's rights, they don't necessarily agree on tactics or anything like that, but they certainly are very strong. They certainly are completely sincere in their beliefs, and those beliefs are held very strongly. And they believe, perhaps more importantly, for the purposes of the course and the purposes of what we're talking about here, they believe that human beings have the ability to improve themselves and therefore improve their society. And they believe that to a much greater extent than, say, the founding generation does. Okay. And that's why these religious groups seem to project their ideas outward. Right? They get involved in anti-slavery. They get involved in temperance. They get involved in things other than just religion. But let's start off, if you don't mind, David, and talk about what was the Second Great Awakening.
So I saw it as, I know obviously it's called the Second Great Awakening, but it really does feel like a 2.0 of the first one, where it was able to go further, I would say, both in a literal sense and in a spiritual sense, if you will. And this huge idea of everyone being equal, at least in terms of the soul, this spiritual egalitarianism is a huge driving point in this. And that even the older institutions from the First Great Awakening are now considered, the Orthodox, like the Calvinists, are considered it's too depressing or against this whole spiritual egalitarianism. And that's changed a bit too. So they move away from the Calvinist views, and you start getting into the Methodists, the Mormons rise up in this period of a bunch of different denominations starting to pop up. And there's also this change in what's the word I'm looking for? Spiritual leadership is no longer dictated by someone who's gone through the proper training, right? You don't have to have the degree for it, if you will, anymore. Now, for a lot of them, it's if you've undergone like the calling of God, or you have had some kind of a moment. And so and I would say it's much more individual based as opposed to the congregation, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes perfect sense, and it's exactly right. Go ahead.
That's really mostly what I got from it. Again, and with the Methodists in particular, they were one of the denominations that had the largest flux, or I should say, increase of people flocking towards that ideology in this time period.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was because they were one of those that moved away from what the requirements are to be a part of it and to lead it as well. So they were able to spring up much more often.
Yeah, I think also something, and I should have said this in the morning class, and I didn't. There's an attractiveness to the Methodism of this time period in that it was still very. I mean, maybe they do this now. I don't know. I don't think so. Methodism during the Second Great Awakening really still clung to, and I mean that in a positive sense, the original idea of John and Charles Wesley's method is the idea that time is the most important thing we're given, and therefore you have to count for that time in your day. And Methodists, in fact, there's a method in how you're supposed to run your day and your life, and so you're supposed to divide it up. So it's sort of the original. And again, I don't want this to sound discriminating, pejorative or anything either, but it's, there are a billion books and programs, 12-step programs, and this is how you organize your life, and this is how you become profitable, successful, or rich, or whatever. And they have all these things. Well, Methodism was kind of like a spiritual version of that. Very, very strict Methodists would, from 8 to 10 in the morning would be devoted to prayer. From 10 to 1 would be devoted to work. From 1 to 2 would be devoted. They were very rigid schedule, and that's why it's called Methodism, and that's why and through that, through the progress of that through your life, you would then achieve salvation. So the reason I'm going on about that is because it seems very practical to people, and is something that they can get on board with, and they can understand, and they can implement in their own lives. Okay, so it isn't sort of highbrow. It isn't as much highbrow intellectualizing and of the theology of Christianity as it is this setting goals in your life and following a certain method and following a certain pattern. So it's extremely important. What else about the Second Great Awakening? And anybody here jump in. What else about this Second Great Awakening seems interesting to you? Some of the things.
Continuing in the line that you were even saying, it's changed into more of a faith by action than faith by deeds, in a way. Now, is transcendentalism different from the Methodists then in that way? Or at least what you were just describing? That was my question, I think, when reading it, was when it talked about the transcendentalists. Is that because they have no real set creed?
Yes.
Are they the opposite then of the Methodists?
No, I wouldn't say it's the opposite. But all of these new denominations, faiths, whatever you want to call them, creeds, believe that it's the individual. An individual can achieve salvation for themselves. You don't need an outside authority to tell you. You don't need a church, an established priest. You certainly don't need sacraments, things like that, in order to reach salvation. Now, the transcendentalists believe, so they all believe in different ways of reaching that spiritual fulfillment, but they all agree that it can be done by an individual's study and prayer. It's essentially their argument. So the transcendentalists then, and the transcendentalists later in the 19th century, have very different views from Methodists. They're opposite in the sense that Methodist is very much the here and now. You do, plan out your life and do this, blah blah, or do work this method. And the transcendentalists were much more, can we reach this spiritual plane? Can we talk to people in the spiritual plane? Can we talk to people in past lives, and things like that? Can we transcend this world and still remain alive? And the Methodists, to the extent they would have engaged with that at all, would have said the point isn't to do that. The point is to make your life as in the Methodist view as godly as possible. The interesting point that you brought up, though, Dave, which is, I don't know how you phrased it, but it was just right.
Well, faith by action or through action?
No, although it's true, but one of the reasons it's so successful in this period, this sort of blends questions 1 and 2 a little bit. Don't forget, and if I was trying to repeat myself in the morning class, but of course you weren't in the morning class, so I should repeat myself. An awful lot of this stuff has to do with the West. And by the West, I mean here, Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio, right. eventually Indiana. And I think, as I said Tuesday, a lot of that is helped by advanced technological advances like the Erie Canal, but also things like the Pennsylvania Turnpike becoming a more extensive and professionally run phenomenon. Okay, it's not obviously like it is now, but it was one of the big government infrastructure things, and the Erie Canal was one of the big public-private partnership infrastructure things that made all sorts of things possible. Whereas for the First Great Awakening, things couldn't spread as easily, couldn't spread as well, couldn't spread as fast. Now they did spread, but just not as fast. So if you look at those circuit preachers, for instance, that your book talks about, well, circuit preachers now, because of the Erie Canal and other things, and the Turnpike, can start moving further west and having larger circuits. Whereas before, you didn't really have circuit preachers in the East Coast because they were just sort of there in their own communities. And that's one of the ways I think that, no one says, don't get me wrong, this isn't deliberate. No one says, aha, we have the Erie Canal, so let's have a second great awakening and spread the word westward, and it'll improve life, improve everything. It doesn't like,
right, it just happened to be that way.
They don't really necessarily notice it going on. They just, because it's, for them, it's happening quite slowly. When we look at it, it happens very fast. But before I start talking too much about that, because that has to do with these economic changes, let's ask who is in group 2.
I am.
Yeah, shoot, Lance.
Okay, so well, I was going like with the economical way, like
yeah,
the thing that you brought up about like the circuit riders, those were brought in during that time, and it kind of seemed like it had a lot more growth. Like the Methodists kind of had a rapid growth during that time. And would you consider I guess Mormons kind of grew a lot, and it was the same time it was created, though? I don't know how.
Yes, but Mormons is one of the groups. They don't necessarily evangelize, or they don't necessarily in that period, they don't try to convert people as much as, say, the Methodists do.
Yeah.
And they don't really have circuit riders, but it is the same idea.
Yeah, they still grew. And now for like I don't know, I'd say like for the gender side of things, you kind of had like I know like the Protestants, they were trying to improve the women's rights. Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then but like there was but like with the I don't want to say it was bad. I don't know what they expect, but like with the Mormons, they kind of seem to have, I don't know, taken advantage of like you know what I mean? And I think there was one other group. I'm trying to think. Oh no, never mind. Yeah.
Well, remember that the crucial thing for gender relations in this question anyway is that these new faiths believe that men and women are spiritually equal. Now, that does not necessarily mean that they can then become that they're equal in other aspects, or that women and men should participate to an equal degree in the various other parts of life, politics, economic, society, the law, whatever, education, whatever. But they were spiritually equal, so that it does, so that, and it's because of all this individualism thing. If you are individually able to find Christian salvation without the aid of, or without the strict instructions of an established church or whatever, then it kind of doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman, and your roles in society can be traditional or not traditional. So in a way, these new religious reform movements aren't necessarily pushing for the equality of women in society, although some of them are. Okay, the important thing for this is that they're pushing for their spiritual equality. But I sort of interrupted you, Lance. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's about all. I kind of struggled with this one a little bit.
Well, it's and this is where I want to I don't want to turn this into a little lecture, but it's an interesting problem. It's an interesting question, interesting problem, because it like I say, it kind of develops naturally in the sense that it's sort of slow moving at the time. And for instance, one of the ways in which these religious movements respond to economic conditions at the time is, for instance, let's take the Methodist circuit riders. The circuit riders would go out to, let's just say, a preacher is given a circuit here to Erie, over to State College, and back to, that big sort of whole Western Pennsylvania loop. Now, they're not given a loop that big there. Usually have smaller loops, but let's just for simplicity's sake. Well, they might not do a great deal of preaching in Pittsburgh, but when they get to, although they would obviously, but when they get to little towns or little settlements or little farming communities or places, do you know the town Emmleton in Pennsylvania? It's between here and Erie. I don't know if it's halfway or whatever, but it's up there, and it's kind of
through it. That's about it.
Yeah, it's one of these little towns. A friend of mine is in the lumber business up there. I've been in it, and it retains a lot of early 19th century character to it, and that's why I always think of when I think of these preachers. Well, the Methodist preacher would leave Pittsburgh, probably, I don't know, preach in Ross Township, for instance, and on his way, but the word would kind of go ahead of them. And when they arrived in a town like, well, I don't even think Ross Township was a town, but you know what I'm saying. When they arrived in some place like Emmleton, it was a very big deal for all kinds of reasons. One reason was that there wasn't a lot else to do in Emmleton except work your tail off, right, and go to church or study the Bible at home. So they show up in Emmleton, and it becomes an event, and lots of people go to listen to these preachers, just as they do to revivalist preachers in the 20th century, the big tent revivals and things like that. I'm not trying to deny their theological interest, but they also go because it is, everybody's going, and you'll see everybody there, and people dress up for it and things like that. And so those preachers are able to take advantage of improvements in the postal system, improvements in roads, improvements in because say the Erie Canal, but also the improvements in communication. So they were able to build crowds and expectation when they arrive. So it's not just the fact that they're coming to town to preach. They don't just show up and someone says, "Oh, there's a guy here. Oh, and he says, "Oh, I'm going to preach," and everyone says, "Okay," and sort of straggles in. No, they're known well ahead of time, and then they would stay in a town like Hamilton for 2 or 3 or 4 days and stay with a family and be put up. And by the way, they collect money on the way in order to pay their expenses. Nobody profiteers really off this that I can think of. No preachers anyway. And that helps build that is partly a community building or a status building exercise within these little communities. So Ma and Pa Hamilton, or perhaps say the most prominent people in town, well, they want to insist that the Methodist preacher stays with them or whatever, right? And so I don't say there's a competition or a fight between who should the preacher stay with, but it becomes a marker of respectability and a mark of status to have the preacher in your family, for lack of a better word, unit, as well as in your community unit. Okay, so they preach, they'd stay the night, have dinner and stay the night with Mom and Pa Hamilton. Mom and Pa Hamilton would have all nephews and nieces and whoever else spread around come to the house. There'd be this sort of mini gathering. They were really pretty big events. And because of that, then the messages get out. Okay, so when something is that big of an event, what the things that people are saying are gonna matter, are gonna touch people, are gonna become relevant to people's lives. So that's very, very, very important. I don't want to talk too much without getting into question 3. And again, this is something that doesn't change in American history. Revivalist meetings, big meetings like this, go on and on and on. They're huge in the 30s and 40s, and even huge in the 20s and 30s, pretty big in the 40s, and then they become televised later on. And now you have mega churches. Now maybe those mega church preachers don't move around. I don't know. But it was definitely the event of the season for the Methodist preacher or whatever preacher to come into your town. Absolutely the event of the season. Okay. And the reason I'm trying to say that, I'm sorry if I'm losing my train of thought here, is it has all these knock-on effects, right? That people gather, the people set up stalls to sell things, to trade, to do other stuff. Organizations preachers often leave organizations in their wake. Well, a lot of people will gather together and say, we need to have a bowling club. People used to outdoor bowling then, and the preacher would say, yes, that's good, healthy exercise. So why don't you call it the First Methodist Bowling Club? So that they said that it inspires people to do other civic things as well. All right, what about question 3? Is anyone here from question 3? Heather, Zion, Matt, okay, well, no, all right. Well, let me just say, this is in your book and it's in some of your readings too, so it should be pretty obvious. One of the things that's the biggest difference between, one of the things that the Second Great Revival does is it increases the participation of religious people in social problems like slavery, like anti-slavery, and like education reform, and in the reclamation of prostitutes and things like that in the bigger cities. Okay. And one of the because once the Great Awakening helps intensify the religious community, and with a small c meaning everybody, then within that community there can be the first Methodist uh, the First Methodist Library book sharing club, or whatever. There is now a network on which information can travel, ideas can travel to try to improve things. Communities start sending people of similar interest to other communities to talk. It's not just the preachers who are going around in the circuit. This is more of the anti-slavery question in number 4, but the Methodist anti-slavery group in Hamilton will start going to the Methodist anti-slavery group in Erie and talk, and they would have a get together and talk about things. And that's a big change. Okay, First Great Awakening is almost all intellectual and all spiritual. Doesn't necessarily have these practical applications like the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, especially when it comes to temperance, temperance, anti-slavery, and women's reform, is very, very important. The temperance movement becomes extremely invigorated by the Second Great Awakening in this period. People build, and I'm not kidding, people build temperance temples along canals. Okay, places where canal men can come and stop and get fresh water. Okay, and that had always existed. Right? They'd have water and food and whatever as you go down the canal. But pretty soon they start to become little shrines, and I won't say churches because it doesn't go that far, in themselves. And so there's a shrine. I have a friend who was working on this at the University of Virginia. These temperance temples on the side, on the banks of canals, and it's astounding. And it's obvious what they're doing, because the temple is facing the canal. It has artwork and sculptures that depict the purity of water, the purity of baptism, the purity of and the idea is to enlighten and refresh people, refresh their spirituality as we go along. And if you can refresh that by not offering them booze, right? One of the most successful canal stops and the most successful businesses to have along the locks and dams of canals was a tavern. Well, the temperance temples try to replace that, or at least give people the opportunity to have something besides booze, and also give temperance campaigners a way to promote temperance itself. And it's unlikely this would have just happened. It's unlikely that temperance especially would have would have had the strength that it had as a movement in this period without that religious injection. Okay, the more you get into, it's one of these things that if you were history majors or aspiring history majors, the more you get into it, temperance is just absolutely fascinating. In fact, I know 2 people. One person here at Carnegie Mellon just finished her PhD on local temperance meeting halls and stuff like that. It's just absolutely gripping and intriguing. Okay, and the important thing is that they also say, because you're an individual and you can have individual spiritual renewal or discovery, or however they wanted to portray it, you as an individual can now start working towards helping renew, fix society in the same way that you've helped renew / fix your own religion, if you see what I mean. Okay. So people are borrowing ideas. In fact, they don't even think of it as borrowing an idea from religion and using it in social. They think of it as the same thing. Okay, whereas we might think of it as a slightly different thing. promoting abstinence, promoting all kinds of things, becomes much easier when you can have this theological, not theological, but this spiritual commitment behind you, and also other people to help you. It's no, this is sort of bleeding into question 3, Catherine, and I'm sorry. It's no accident. It's absolutely no accident at all that there are tons of Second Great Awakening churches, not churches, colleges. Well, there are churches too. Colleges spread all across this part of the country, especially Western New York, Western Pennsylvania, especially Ohio and Eastern Indiana. You can't go, you stumble around Eastern Ohio, you can't go 15 feet without bumping into a college that was set up by anti-slavery or temperance people back in the 1830s. They're just everywhere. A lot of them eventually closed down, and some of them consolidated and whatnot. And most of them don't have that religious connection anymore. There's still private colleges, but they almost all, well, they're just hundreds of them. And it's really that phenomenon alone is very fascinating. The University of Virginia is not founded to promote, is not founded by abolitionists or temperance people, but Ohio Wesleyan is, right? And it's not founded just to teach temperance or abolitionism, but it's founded because abolitionists feel that this is part of their calling to create this institution of higher learning that will help end the slave trade, slavery. Okay. It's do any of you have Ohio roots or Western New York? I mean, I'm trying to think of the colleges in Western PA that are like this. I don't know why they're so much more common in Ohio, but they're just everywhere in Ohio. Well, anyway, there it is. That's what I'm trying to say. It's just astounding at how many of these things, and they're all founded between 1800 and 1840. It's just a million of them. Often them Kenyon College is often them. Some of them are the best colleges in the country. Liberal arts colleges. Kenyon College is one. College of Worcester is another one. These are very, very serious places, and the whole period of them being created was fascinating. But Samantha, not Samantha. Catherine, I'm about to start horning in on your question. So, why did anti-slavery Americans begin to demand the immediate abolition of slavery? Sorry, there my voice is going.
So I know a lot of reformers believes that, it was like a very terrible sin. So they tried to pull, Christianity in it. So I know there were different people. They kind of had the idea of like immediate emancipation, so they could convince enslavers to voluntarily release their like enslaved laborers by appealing to their Christian conscience.
Yeah, that's important, because there are of course gradual, ever since the founding of the country, there are gradual abolitionists, people who believe slavery is going to die of its own weight. It's going to be crushed under its own weight. Just let it go. Eventually, we don't need to have immediate abolition. But of course, immediate abolitionists argue that it's unchristian to do otherwise. Sorry, Catherine, I promised not to jump in on people's talking, and I just did.
Yeah, I know there were a couple like prominent people. One of them was William Garrison, because I know he advocated for both Black colonization and gradual abolition. And then I know he established a newspaper called The Liberator to promote immediate emancipation.
Right.
And then they also people that came together to create the American Anti-Slavery Society.
Right.
So they kind of, again, bonded their causes to, Christianity and all that.
Yeah, William Lloyd Garrison. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I said I think I'm going to kind of stop there, because I know there's somebody else in here. I think Sam's also in my group.
Yep, that's right.
Oh, okay, Sam, shoot.
There were, well, going on with what you said, there was a lot of connection, a lot more than usual. So people from Britain and America started talking about what worked and what not worked in their government. So for example, like if the British government abolished a certain type of slavery, they tried to push for it in America. They shared different ideas, arguments, publications, and stuff like that.
Mhm.
So with this connection of ideas, it was able to create a type of connection so they can push for stuff, like push in politics and push in the churches, and again push in the South. Mostly Kansas, but that turned into a little bit of a bloodshed, but
A little bit, yeah.
just a little bit.
They call it Bleeding Kansas for a reason. Yeah.
That's true. So it was very well adapted in the North, but the South was a little wary on accepting it.
Mhm.
I could tell you for sure that America wouldn't be exactly the same if it wasn't for them setting up America this way for like Lincoln and the future presidencies.
Yes, and I think it's very important to. Sorry, before I say that, you're probably going to think of something else. Say
No,
so.
you can go ahead. You go ahead.
Well, this is so powerful. This idea of this anti-slavery that what am I trying to say? Crap. Everybody notices. Everybody especially in the South, notices, and this is so because these things are sweeping north and more important, so sweeping from in the north, but also sweeping west. More importantly, the planters, Southern slave planters realize, there are all these Northern fanatics out there preaching anti-slavery, preaching abolition, preaching immediate abolition, right? And it's a growing movement. And so that plot combined with the idea that, remember, as I said a couple of last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, that after the invention of the cotton gin and after cotton becomes king, there's this sort of after the fact justification of slavery as a positive good. It's what God wanted. It's what made Rome great. It's what made Egypt great. Well, you combine so the generation of slavers in the teens, in the 20s and 30s, 1820s and 30s, completely different attitude towards slavery than the founders. And so you have this idea now we think of it as a positive good, and it's a positive good that these Yankees extremists, religious types are going to try to take away from us. It's not surprising. Then it sort of makes sense how fervent pro-slavery becomes in the run-up to Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, and then of course in the run-up to the Civil War. But the fact that these things take hold and that it doesn't look like it's obvious that it's moving west scares the pants off Southern planters. Okay, so it's the rise and the justification of the good of slavery, they think, plus the rise in the anti-slavery movement that really helps lead to secession. But now keep going, Sam, keep going, Catherine, however.
Well, I focused on the British in the America type of interactions and how it influenced the immediatism, because once one person got the idea, it spread rapidly. Like in the 1840 anti-slavery convention, I forget the exact name, but anyone that attended there, the majority was all for it. As soon as they heard the idea, they really enjoyed it. And then with those people, they went out to their areas and they spread the word, and it just grew rapidly. So with the
Yeah.
amount of people on board with this, it was really how it spread it spread so fast that it started getting both this North and South attention, but it also got some people on the political standpoint to get their attention towards it, which was not really prevalent like immediately. It wasn't like a heated subject until like this point. Well, I shouldn't say heated subject. It wasn't going to take much action until this point.
Yes, it becomes much more heated. There aren't radical anti-slavers, and on the other hand, radical slave promoters in the founders period. You know, it's definitely intensifies in this period. Now, don't get me wrong. One of the things that's often too easy to do is to fall into the trap of, people are saying, great, there's this new great awakening. Therefore, we can start the anti-slavery movement and piggyback off them. They're great. There's the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal can help us with the Great Awakening. It can also help us with anti-slavery promotion. But people weren't that conniving about it, right? They didn't feel it. It's just sort of these things interwove together because that's what was happening. Okay. What else? Samantha, you're going to say something else, I think. No, sorry, not Samantha. What am I saying? Catherine.
I guess I could kind of talk a little bit more about how there was a lot of opposition with it, because most Americans, they didn't like how they were going about things. So a lot of times they were attacked. And then I know like with the North, like northern mobs, they would sometimes, one of the particular examples I happen to take note of, it was some of the northern mobs, they kind of smashed like abolitionists, like printing presses. They even killed like, an anti-slavery newspaper editor. So there was a lot of opposition with that too.
Yeah, this is not, these are all new ideas. These are ideas that could potentially upend things, because don't forget, which we tend to do too much, I think. A lot of Northerners are pro-slavery too, because they're making a ton of money out of it. Well, partly because they're making a ton of money out of it. The last thing that mill owners in upstate New York want is to be paying for raw cotton that on the open market. They want slave produced cotton because it's much cheaper. Okay, if independent farmers are producing cotton in the South, that raises the price, because their labor has to be paid for. Then a cotton distributor has to add on to that, and on and on and on. Well, if the labor is essentially free, the end price for the mill owner is a lot cheaper. Okay. And this is a serious problem. And again, the passions that are created over slavery are just shocking. And Bleeding Kansas is only the most extreme version of it. It really does happen a lot, and relatively early on. I was I probably said this already, so sorry, but I was in Albany taking care of my mother, and near Albany, there's a little town called, in fact, my parents' town is called Cohoes. And in Cohoes, there's what was at the time the largest textile mill in the world on the Mohawk River. And So I go there. They've turned it into these really cool apartments now. It's just massive big rooms, and where they had to have the spinning machines and all that stuff. And they had several of these, and they're each like half a mile long, right? There's only one remaining, the main one. But in the 19th century, there were 6 of them. So this is big business. Okay? This isn't just, little sewing circles in New England making whatever embroidery. This is the steel of its day. It's extremely important. All right, what else before we move on to Jenny and women's rights? Okay, Jenny, how about you and the moving for women's rights? Are you there still? I don't hear you. I think I heard you briefly.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can. Yeah.
Okay, sorry. So women during this time, they were out in the public a lot more often than previous. They took part in a lot of social movements and reforms like the temperance movement, the education reforms, and in particular, I think the women's rights saw like in conjunction with the abolition movement. Because a lot of women they spoke against the slaves, like they went to conventions and talk about I think it was the Grimke sisters that spoke.
Yeah, the Grimke, the document that's in your reader.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they said how they witnessed the horrors of slavery firsthand, they were born to on a plantation, how they saw all that horrors, but I guess the audience didn't really take them seriously because they were women and they didn't accept the abolition movement, so they kind of saw that how in order to proceed in the abolition movement, they had to kind of gain women's right in order to speak out against that. And I think the book compared to how somehow some of the women's rights that they don't have, they compare that to the conditions of slavery, how it restricted the property rights, for education.
Yeah, don't one of the things, again, don't I mean this to everybody, not just you. One of the things we tend to do is we think of women's rights and everybody jumps in this one big container and agrees with everything from property rights all the way up to voting rights. Whereas, different women's rights groups believe in different things. An awful lot of them believe that rights of inheritance, rights of property, rights over control of children, that's what we want. We don't want the vote, for instance, because that's politics, that's dirty, that's grubby, that's a very male thing. That's, women want to be pure of that, and other women want the vote, right? They say you're not going to get property rights or inheritance rights unless you get the vote. So, like everything else, like even the temperance movement, there are degrees. There are people who say we want people to be more temperate, drink less, that is, or less frequently at least. And then there are people who want people to be abstinent, completely abolish drinking. Well, exactly the same in abolition of slavery. There are people who want gradual abolition. There are people who want immediate abolition, and all various groups in between. There's a very strong strain of opinion that says, in slavery anyway, that and this has a direct opinion direct on women's rights, and I'll explain that in a minute. Well, my notes. That says we can't have immediate abolition for all kinds of reasons. There's too much sectional discord over it. the cotton industry, the textile industry will fail, blah, 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 blah. But what we can do is we can ban it in the West, ban it west of the of a certain point, and therefore it'll be only restricted to the South, and it will probably eventually in 50 years die off. Okay, so there's a sort of gradual abolitionist, there's the Western abolitionist, and there's the immediate abolitionist. Now, the reason I said that how it relates to women is because what happens in the women's movement later than this period is in the 1870s is Western territories become the first places where women are allowed to vote. One of the reasons is that the territories get to choose how they make up their electorate, and they want to attract new settlers. So come on here, you can vote. So Wyoming is the first place that gives women the vote. So, and what I'm trying to say is, don't forget there are all kinds of diversity within these reform movements. Some of them want to reform for traditionalist reasons. Some of them want to reform for what eventually will be called progressive reasons. It just it just depends how and where they want to see the country end up eventually. Sorry, that was a very long interruption, Jenny, of what you were saying.
No, you're good. Yeah, I think the book talked a little about that, how it divided the women because they want like going towards the same rights, like how like the right to vote was very controversial among them, like especially among the men, like they didn't agree with that since they didn't think like women should be part of the politics.
Yes, and there were, and then on the other hand, there were men involved in the women's suffrage movement. After all, in 1848, in the Seneca Falls Convention, that was organized by women, but they had it chaired by a man. And they had technically the Seneca Falls petition was written by a man. So there are pro-women's rights, pro-women's suffrage men involved too. Some of them are kind of like cardboard figures put up to make it more appealing to everyone, but there are a great number of men who were, really believed this. And by the way, that reminds me, I'm going to put a podcast up about this after class. Seneca Falls, although it gets since I happen to be blathering on about New York State so much lately, Seneca Falls is obviously an upstate, Western New York state. It gets treated as the birthplace of the women's rights movements, and it's not true. There were major conventions for women's voting in other places. There's one in Worcester, Massachusetts, as early as 1830. But it's one of these things that just Seneca Falls becomes the famous one because the Seneca Falls people promote it as the famous one in the 1850s, and it just people latch onto it as that ideal. What else about this?
I guess going to Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for that, and she kind of modeled that based on like the Declaration of Independence and how that related to women's right and the independence of like America, like what it was founded on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost exactly like the Declaration of Independence in that there's a list of sentiments. This, we feel this, we feel that, we feel this, and it isn't just vague things like please treat us better. So we want this, we want that, or this, we want that. And by the way, when the secession declarations are written by the southern states in 1859, 1860, or I guess 1869. I don't think there's one as early as 59. Anyway, they're using the Declaration of Independence as a model, as a sort of template. We want that. This is the reason why slavery needs to be protected. This is the reason why we're seceding. All kinds of political documents are written using the Declaration of Independence as a model, including the Vietnamese one in the 1940s. So that's it's very fascinating how strong that idea of a declaration of sentiments or a Declaration of Independence is, and then to follow that form of listing grievances or listing demands. Okay, now before my throat finally rebels against me, may I ask you this? Now, this is not universally true, but it seems to be true. Remember how I started offering people this option of promoting, option of placing their discussions. Oh, sorry. Discussion answers on Canvas. Well, actually, there are quite a few people here in your group that are doing it. What I found this morning, in morning's group, there were I don't know how to say this without angering people, because it's not universally true, but usually it's the best students in a section who are showing up for discussion, and it's the weaker students who are the stronger students who are showing up for discussion, and the weaker students who are using the online thing. Now, that's not universally the case. There are several people. In fact, Sam did both. But this morning's group, this is, by the way, this is one way of telling you all of you are doing very well. I don't know. It does that seem to be, well, I don't know how, that's not the question I wanted to ask. No, never mind. Any question I frame and ask you about the nature of student habits these days is bound to come out the wrong way, and I might get in trouble. I just wonder whether having that, see, because I'm teaching in the fall and in the spring I'm teaching in person, and I was debating whether or not to have the discussion boards on Canvas, even though I'm also teaching in person. You can sort of understand it in this framework where we're online all the time, that we have two online versions of what you could do. But I was thinking about having discussion boards in Canvas next semester, but then I was thinking, well, that'll just encourage people to skip class. And I think that the discussions are better in person. Anyway, what do you think? That's my question. What do you think?
I don't know. I guess I like it in person more. Like it's just easier to talk instead of writing everything out. Like
Yeah.
you like explain everything.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way.
Do you feel you get more out of the class when we're able to talk bandy stuff back and forward?
Yeah, I do.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Both Lance and Sam said that at the same time. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go, and then I'm going to start manually uploading those grades, or manually emailing the grades to you, and then uploading them to Canvas. So, any other questions? No. All right. Adios.
Thank you.